off and the clock has started. Yes, sir. Reading it loud and clear.
Roger, roll. Discovery.
Discovery, roger, very well.
Well, thank you, Andrew, and welcome to the October 3rd, 2018 edition of Space News. This is Peter Aylward, and once again I have Michael Abdullah and Angelo De Grazia with me from the Space Association. Good evening, gentlemen.
G'day, Peter. How you going?
G'day, everyone. How are you?
Fantastic. All right, we're going to have a fair bit of space news tonight, so strap in and let's get into it. Gilmour Space secures $19 million to launch the next generation hybrid rockets to space. Cheaper and faster rockets could soon become a reality after a major investment into a Gold Coast space company. Gilmour Space Technologies, a leading hybrid propulsion company in Queensland and Singapore, has raised $19 million to scale up and launch its first commercial hybrid rocket into orbit in 2020. Gilmour Space is developing low-cost launch vehicles to put small to medium-sized satellites into low Earth orbit, and has attracted funding from CSIRO's Innovation Fund, managed by Main Sequence Ventures and Blackbird Ventures, which led Gilmour Space's $5 million Series A round in May of last year. The small satellite revolution is gaining momentum globally, with thousands of small satellites slated to launch into low Earth orbit over the next 5 years, says the company's CEO and founder Adam Gilmour. However, he cautioned that these new players will be challenged by high launch costs and limited launch opportunities. To address this anticipated bottleneck, Gilmour Space is developing a new breed of hybrid rockets that will offer dedicated low Earth orbit launches to small satellite customers at a very competitive price. As previously reported here on Space News, the company plans to launch Iris 100 in 2020, a three-stage commercial vehicle capable of launching 100 kilograms to low Earth orbit, followed by Iris 400 in 2021, a clustered engine vehicle for payloads up to 400 kilograms. This round of investment will give us the safe runway we need to build and launch our first commercial hybrid rockets to space in 2020. Since January 2018, Gilmour Space has achieved a number of other key milestones. It completed a series of ground tests on its proprietary orbital class hybrid rocket engine, generating a record 80 kilonewtons or 18,000 pounds of thrust, signed a Space Act agreement with NASA, the first private company to do so in Australia, and attracted two senior space veterans to its advisory board: Colonel Pamela Melroy, a retired colonel in the US Air Force, a test pilot and ex-NASA astronaut and Space Shuttle commander, and Professor Dava Newman, the former Deputy Administrator for NASA and current Apollo Program Professor at Aeronautics and Astronautics and Engineering Systems at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Gilmour Space is now preparing for suborbital test flights in the next few months' time. Over to you, Mike.
Okay, growing Australia's space industry capability. The Australian Space Agency has signed a statement of strategic intent with European manufacturing giant Airbus Defence and Space SAS, representing another step in growing the capability and competitiveness of Australia's space sector. The Minister for Industry, Science and Technology, Karen Andrews, welcomed the signing, the first by Australia's new agency with an industry partner, sending a strong signal for further investment opportunities. Airbus has a major presence in Australia, supplying Earth observation satellite imagery to the Australian market for over 25 years, Minister Andrews said. Australian Space Agency head Dr. Megan Clark said the statement of intent by Airbus highlighted the role Australia could play in the growing global space economy. Nicholas Chamussi, Executive Vice President Space Systems at Airbus Defence and Space, said, "We look forward to working with the Australian Space Agency as well as the country's academia, small to medium-sized enterprises and startups to develop Australia's sovereign space capability." Peter.
A roadmap to unlock the potential of Australia's space economy has been released. Deep space exploration, Earth observation and debris tracking have been identified as key growth opportunities for Australia's space sector in a CSIRO report launched at the 18th Australian Space Research Conference held on the Gold Coast last week. Minister for Industry, Science and Technology Karen Andrews launched SPACE, a roadmap for unlocking future growth opportunities for Australia, the latest industry roadmap from Australia's National Science Agency. CSIRO's report is a key component in planning the future pathway for the Australian space industry, she said. Following extensive consultations with industry, the report outlines how some of Australia's strengths and geographic advantages are key to enhancing our share of the international space sector and growing the size of our domestic space industry to $12 billion by 2030. The Space Roadmap presents 3 key areas for potential development. 1. By harnessing our diverse industry and research strengths across astronomy, mining, manufacturing, medicine, agriculture and robotics for Earth-based industry, we can support space exploration and deep space gateway habitats to safely conduct robotic and human missions. Number 2. By building our capabilities in observing Earth from space, satellite communications and positioning, navigation and timing data, we can grow new businesses that address issues such as disaster and water management. And number 3, by taking advantage of Australia's geographic position in the Southern Hemisphere, we can further our work with international programs that track objects in space, manage space debris, and enable deep space communication.
Continuing with our Australian theme, the Hunter-Killer satellite, a new weapon in the battle against space junk. It may sound futuristic, but researchers from the Australian National University and Tohoku University in Japan have found a new way of dealing with space junk, and it involves a new type of satellite powered by superheated gas. Space debris orbiting the Earth has become a major problem in recent decades. If it collides with spacecraft, it can cause serious damage and create even more debris. Now, a study just published in the journal Scientific Reports has found a satellite could be sent up to seek out and shift this debris. It would work by shooting out a beam of hot plasma or ionized gas from the opposite end of the satellite. This would allow the satellite to push the space junk down into a lower orbit so it eventually decays, or push it up to get it out of the way of other objects. Our tests show you can push plasma out one end of a satellite and thrust it towards the junk, and then push it out the other end to send the junk into the right direction, Professor Rod Boswell from the Australian National University Research School of Physics and Engineering said. A piece of space junk will naturally decay within around 2 years if it's below the 500 kilometres from the Earth's surface, because the atmosphere is still dense enough to cause friction, which causes the junk to gradually get slower and lower. Above 500 kilometres, it presents a much tougher problem. It's going to take a long time to come down. I call this Hunter-Killer satellite because it would have to hunt out the space junk, Professor Boswell said. From the ground, you can calculate the orbit trajectory so you know within a certain number of kilometres, but then it would have to find the junk with its own radar. Amazing. And finally, in some more Australian space news, Australia's new space agency is looking for a role in NASA's Gateway project. Megan Clark, the head of the Australian Space Agency, said in an ABC interview last week that the agency has already been in discussions with NASA about roles it could play on the Gateway or a future lunar base. She suggested Australian experience dealing with harsh environments on Earth give it capabilities it could offer for a lunar facility, but didn't elaborate on specific technologies or other roles. Look out for further announcements from the Australian Space Agency at this week's International Astronautical Congress being held in Bremen, Germany. Exciting times ahead for Australia. Well, let's go across the Pacific to the United States. A House member has introduced a bill that would authorise an extension of the International Space Station to 2030. Representative Brian Babin, Republican Texas, chairman of the House Space Subcommittee, said at a hearing last week that his leading human spaceflight act would extend the ISS, preserving it as the crown jewel of NASA's human spaceflight program. Similar language calling for an ISS extension to 2030 is in the Senate Space Frontier Act, introduced a couple of months ago. You'll recall that NASA's fiscal year 2019 budget proposal sought to end direct funding of the ISS in the mid-2020s, transitioning activities to commercial providers. NASA officials at both House and Senate hearings last week, including Jim Bridenstine, said they want to avoid a gap in human activities in low Earth orbit, particularly as China develops its own space station in the early 20s. The real reason.
That's right.
Interesting. Moving on to NASA General. NASA's administrator, Jim Bridenstine, said that he has a good relationship with his Russian counterpart despite recent events and past statements. Speaking at a Washington Space Business Roundup luncheon last week, Bridenstine said his one conversation to date with Dmitry Rogozin, head of Roscosmos, was very positive. That phone conversation took place earlier this month during the investigation of the hole found in the Soyuz MS-09 spacecraft. Bridenstine acknowledged Rogozin's past aggressive comments about the US when he was Deputy Prime Minister of Russia, but said the relationship was different now. Bridenstine and Rogozin are both scheduled to appear at the International Astronautical Congress this week in Germany and will meet in person at next month's Soyuz launch. An exploration roadmap report released by NASA last week outlines its plans for human missions to the Moon and Mars, but with very few new details. The National Space Exploration Campaign report was required by a 2017 NASA authorization bill and was originally due to Congress last December. The report discusses plans to establish the gateway in cislunar space and develop a series of lunar landers, including one in the late 2020s capable of carrying people, but offers few technical or fiscal details that the agency had not already disclosed. Let's move to China. China plans to deorbit its Tiangong 2 laboratory module next year. The Deputy Director of the China Manned Space Engineering Office said last week that the spacecraft will be deliberately deorbited in July 2019 after nearly 3 years in orbit. The spacecraft hosted a two-person crew and served as a platform for testing a cargo spacecraft during its time in space. The controlled deorbit is intended to prevent a repeat of Tiangong 1, which made an uncontrolled re-entry over the Pacific in April after ground controllers lost contact with the spacecraft. Meanwhile, Chinese officials said they will conduct large-scale scientific experiments on their future space station, which will replace Tiangong 2. A deputy chief designer of the station said that work in more than 30 research areas is planned for the station, including a large optical telescope that will be flown in the same orbit as the station. China plans to operate the station for more than 10 years after its assembly is completed in 2022. However, development of China's space station could be delayed by launch vehicle issues. A Chinese official said last week that the first launch of the Long March 5B will not take place in the first half of next year as was previously planned. China planned to use that vehicle to launch elements of its space station starting in 2020. Officials did not give a reason for the delay or a new launch date. And in more Chinese space news, a Chinese company claims to have made progress on a reusable spaceplane. The China Aerospace Science and Industry Corporation said it recently completed a flight test of Tengfei-1, a spaceplane with both jet and rocket engines. However, the video the company showed at a Chinese conference last week only used computer-generated graphics rather than actual flight test footage. The company didn't state when the vehicle would be ready to enter service, although past reports indicate that would take place around 2030. Michael.
Okay, moving to India. India may select an initial core of as many as 30 astronauts for its human spaceflight program. In an interview, the head of the Institute of Aerospace Medicine in the Indian Air Force said he expected the country to select an initial group of 30 people for the country's first astronaut corps. Of those 30, 15 would be given basic training and 3 sets of 3 would undergo training for the first mission, with one of those 3 groups picked for the first flight about 3 months before the launch. That mission is planned for launch by 2022, according to the goal set by Prime Minister Narendra Modi in a speech last month.
Okay, let's go back to the United States and we'll talk about United Launch Alliance. As widely expected, United Launch Alliance finally announced last week it will use Blue Origin's BE-4 engine on its new Vulcan rocket. ULA said it will use 2 BE-4 engines on the first stage of its Vulcan rocket, which is scheduled to make its first launch in 2020. ULA had long been expected to pick the BE-4 over Aerojet Rocketdyne's AR-1, but in recent months would only say that a decision would be coming soon. Aerojet will be providing the RL-10 engines for the Vulcan's upper stage, with Northrop Grumman, L3 Avionics and RUAG among the other major suppliers for the vehicle. The announcement comes after months of negotiations on cost and schedule, as well as ULA's concerns about relying on a potential competitor. ULA, though, had long indicated that Blue Origin's BE-4 engine was the front-runner to power the first stage of its Vulcan rocket versus Aerojet Rocketdyne's AR-1. Indeed, as recently as early last week, regulatory filings by Aerojet indicated that the AR-1 would not be in production in time to support ULA's schedule for a first Vulcan launch in 2020. Peter.
All right, that's it for this week. Thank you, Andrew, and we hand it back to you. Thank you, gentlemen. Good night.